Hi everybody, my name is Michaela Pascoe, thank you for having me. And yes, we'll have a little bit of a gear change, I guess, with this. My area of interest is clinical depression and anxiety, but I've done most research in terms of clinical depression. And I've done a lot of work looking at the role of stress in depression, and that's led me to look at some things that can mediate or have an influence on stress, which has led to a bit of an interest in physical activity and yoga in particular. So what we'll talk about, I'll just introduce stress briefly. I know we have a mixed audience, so I apologise if I'm repeating anything or boring you all with old information. I'll talk a little bit about maladaptive stress and how this can be associated with mental health problems, particularly depression. But I would like to point out that it's not just depression, which is, I guess, what we've seen today is stress has an impact across the board in terms of mental health. How yoga can have an impact in terms of stress, and how that can therefore have an impact in terms of our mental health. So we're all stressed in one way or another. We're all familiar with stress. We experience it in our daily lives. And because it's such a common, universal human experience, of course, our brains and our bodies have found a very elegant and wonderful way to deal with that stress and cope with that stress in order to help us function as best we can. So, for example, when you're crossing the road and there's a car coming at you at high speed, you have a very automatic response where the body essentially identifies, or the sensory organs identify that something's coming at you. That information is sent to the brain, and the brain very quickly sends some messages throughout the body that direct attention or direct energy away from non-vital functions like digestion and towards vital functions, or towards doing things to help us remove ourselves from that threatening situation. So we have things like an increase in blood pressure and an increase in heart rate, increase in breathing rate. All of these things mean that we can get blood and oxygen to muscles and vital organs very quickly so that we can jump out of the way of that car before it hits us. In fact, this happens so quickly that you're not even aware of it happening, and that's why you are able to jump out of the way of the car before you're even quite sure what's happened. And then afterwards you sort of look around going, oh, what did happen? And then after that initial and very fast response, there's another part of the stress response that also sort of comes in to help us, and that helps us manage stress in a more ongoing or long-term way as required. So this is associated with a whole lot of changes in the body, some of which are changes in various hormones. And I want to point out cortisol, which is probably the only one I'll talk about for the purpose of today. But cortisol is very useful to us. Like everything in our body, it's been designed to help us survive and adapt, or we've evolved that way. Cortisol is really important for doing a range of things such as maintaining blood sugar levels in a steady level so that we can have energy available to us to deal with whatever it is that's coming at us. It does this by releasing stored glucose from the liver. So while cortisol is really helpful and beneficial to us, unfortunately stresses are not just things like cars coming across the street at us. They're ongoing in our lives in an everyday way. So for example, if you get up in the morning and you've overslept and you realise you're running late, that's a stressor. And then as you run around to try and get ready and try and run to the tram and maybe you miss the tram, that's a stressor. And if you get on the tram and it's very crowded and there's people everywhere and there's somebody with their arm up and they smell terrible and you have to stand there, that's a stressor. Then when you get to work or wherever it is that you're going and you're late for the meeting and you walk in and you're all flustered, that's a stressor. So, and it's not even 9 a.m. So our life is full of these things. And this means that we're continually having this stress response being activated again and again and again, which means that we can have high levels of cortisol or cortisol surges consistently or persistently throughout the body. And it does have an impact. So very high levels of cortisol have been associated with damage to particular brain regions, and these brain regions are really important for the regulation of mood and emotion. The other thing is that these brain regions are also really important for regulating the stress response. So cortisol is also important for turning off the ongoing stress response by sending a feedback message to the brain that says, okay, the threat is gone, we can now stop producing or having increases in all of these various factors that are helping us cope with this stress. But the more cortisol we have, the more desensitized the brain gets to these messages. So it means that, and the more damage that happens to these regions. So it means that the production of cortisol is higher and higher and higher, and the stress response is more easily activated and is less easily brought down, I guess, to a baseline or resting state again. Across the board in mental health issues, people have been shown to have very reactive stress response systems. It's in terms of, I guess, the balance, they're shown to be more stressed than people that don't have mental health issues. So it's pretty important, I guess, that we find ways to try to learn to cope with the stresses in our lives that are ongoing and unavoidable. And yoga has become really popular and a bit of a fad in Western societies over the last few years or decades. It's very commonly practiced. It's one of the most commonly practiced activities or physical activities in Australia. I think it sits somewhere just under AFL. So it's quite popular. And there's been a lot of research to show that it can improve mental health outcomes. I've been looking, or I guess I'm particularly interested in depression and anxiety. But I would like to say that it has an impact in terms of improving mental health or decreasing depression and anxiety symptoms, both in clinical populations, people that have a clinical diagnosis of depression or anxiety, and non-clinical populations, people that might have elevated depression symptoms or anxiety symptoms, but they don't have a clinical diagnosis or they don't have clinical anxiety or depression. It also has been shown to decrease people's levels of self-reported stress. So essentially when you say, are you feeling stressed? If somebody says, I'm an 8 out of 10 stress today, after engaging in yoga, that level comes down. So they might say, maybe I'm a 6 or whatever it might be. And in young people in particular, there's also been a whole range of studies that have demonstrated beneficial effects of yoga practice in terms of mental health and well-being. I'm particularly interested in the relationship with the stress response system and stress reactivity and how that can have an impact in terms of mental health outcomes. So I've been looking a little bit at some of these things that we were talking about earlier that can, or that are activated when people have a stress response. So for example, heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, breathing rate changes, cortisol levels are increased. There's a whole range of other changes as well, but I'll just go into these ones today. And I would like to point out that there's two phases in terms of talking about stress and how people are coping. One is our baseline level of stress, how we are in our day-to-day life, so how much cortisol we have circulating on a daily basis, what our heart rate is like, our blood pressure is like, etc. High levels of stress have been shown to increase these baseline levels in a day-to-day way. But then there's also stress reactivity. When something stressful does happen, how do we respond to that, and how quickly can we come back down to a state of calm again? So in situations where people are exposed to a stressor, some people can have higher or lower responses to this and can take a shorter or a longer period of time in order for those responses to settle again. So through a series of meta-analyses, which is essentially collection and analysis of a whole lot of research studies combined together to look at an overall effect, basically what I found is that yoga practices and more broadly mindfulness practices are associated with changes in blood pressure or decreases in blood pressure, decreases in heart rate, and decreases in cortisol. In terms of, this was across the board looking at different populations. In terms of looking at young people, there hasn't been, although there's been research showing that it's beneficial, there hasn't been as much research showing or looking at the sort of mechanisms in terms of the stress response or stress reactivity. So I just want to spend the rest of this time here today highlighting some of those studies we identified and what their findings were in young people in particular. So there was one study from the USA that looked, it's a small study, it only had 28 people, the N is the sample size, and these individuals were in the 7th grade and they partook or engaged in Hatha yoga for 3 months, 90 minutes 2 to 3 times a week, And that was compared to engaging in music or art classes, or music and art classes. And at the end of this 3-month period, the authors found that engaging in yoga was was associated with decreases in blood pressure, in systolic blood pressure. This was in individuals that had normal blood pressure to begin with. But in the subsample of individuals that were pre-hypertensive, so they had elevated blood pressure or high levels of higher blood pressure at the beginning of the study, the decreases in blood pressure were much greater. It was something about 10 points in blood pressure, and that was both in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So that makes sense, because essentially when the blood pressure is high to begin with, there's much more opportunity for it to come down, whereas if blood pressure is sort of within a clinically normal or healthy range, there's less opportunity for it to drop down. Another study from India, it's also quite a small study, so 28 seems to be a common number here, involved adolescent girls who were living in community homes. So these girls had been displaced. They didn't have a stable place of residence, and no doubt that would be associated with a range of stressful factors and circumstances. So these girls engaged in yoga. The form was unspecified, and unfortunately this is something that we commonly see, not just in yoga, but often in the physical activity literature broadly, is that people say people did physical activity or people did yoga, but they don't really tell us what they did. So that's something I have come across quite a lot. They did tell us how much they did though, so that's good. So over 6 months, engaged for 1 hour, 5 times a week. So that's really quite an intense commitment. And this was compared to games. So the games consisted of jogging, warm-up games. There was also some twisting and mobility exercises, and then things like relay games or team sports. And these authors found that compared to the games, that the girls who were engaged in the yoga had lower heart rate and lower breathing rate. So this means essentially that they were breathing more slowly than people who were engaged in the games. This was at a resting level, so if you just measured heart rate and breathing as somebody's just sitting down and resting and not engaging in any activity. Another thing I want to talk about is cortisol, our good friend that can also hurt us. So in this study, this one is from the USA, there was a sample of university students who had elevated depression, anxiety and stress scores at baseline. So this was a non-clinical population, but people that had some elevated symptoms to begin with. And this study I found particularly interesting because the authors have compared 3 groups. One is what they call integrated yoga, which is more of a traditional or holistic yoga approach, including philosophical underpinnings and with the aim to provide some psychological skills such as increases in mindfulness, which is paying attention to the present moment, and importantly from a perspective of non-judgment and acceptance. So essentially that's, instead of thinking about what's to come in the future or what's happened before, you're being present in the moment and you're just trying to accept that moment and accept yourself in that moment and whatever's happening. Compared to yoga as an exercise, so that was just about doing the asana, which is the physical shapes and the postures, without any of the sort of philosophical or other aspects. And that was compared to filling out surveys, which was the control group, which is arguably a little bit stressful, but anyway, they called that a control. And they looked at, or they found that both the yoga as an exercise and the integrated yoga group were found to have decreases in depression and stress scores, which is quite interesting. And the other thing was that the yoga, or the integrated yoga group was found to have, above and beyond the effect of the yoga as an exercise group, was found to decrease anxiety symptoms and cortisol levels. So that means that it would seem that there's something unique to the yoga or integrated yoga intervention, at least in this particular population of individuals, that is having an impact on the stress response or stress reactivity beyond that of the yoga as an exercise group. And to think about why that might be or what might be going on there, I think it might be useful to think about some of the other things that people might be learning or some of the other stuff that people might be engaging in that could be influencing their stress reactivity or stress response as a result of engaging in yoga. So I just want to talk about one of these things, because there are a handful, but one I would like to highlight is self-compassion. So self-compassion is essentially learning to be more compassionate to oneself, as the name implies. It's about treating yourself as if you would treat somebody that you deeply cared for, a good friend or a loved one, and treating yourself with that same level of kindness and understanding, because often we're our own harshest critics and we're much more hard on ourselves than we are on other people. This is very common across the board, really. So yoga, pretty much all yoga or mindfulness-based interventions have increasing self-compassion, and teaching self-compassion is a cornerstone of some of the philosophical basis or, I suppose, approaches. So essentially people who engage in yoga have been shown to have increases in self-compassion from pre to post, and increases in self-compassion are associated with much better mental health outcomes. So for example, soldiers who return from war in the United States have much better mental health outcomes depending on their self-compassion. Soldiers who have lower self-compassion are more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder compared to soldiers who have higher self-compassion. One study, a reasonably recent study, looked at the impact of self-compassion on stress reactivity in young people, individuals aged 13 to 18 years old, after engaging in a social stressor task. So this social stressor task, that's a tongue twister, involves preparing a speech, delivering that speech, and then doing an arithmetic task. So apparently social public speaking is stressful. Who would have thought? And essentially what they found is that people that had higher self-compassion rated themselves as having lower levels of stress, higher anxiety, people who had high self-compassion had lower stress, lower anxiety, and higher overall life satisfaction. They also showed, in response to this stressful task, lower systolic blood pressure increases. So in terms of how much the blood pressure was increasing as a result of the task, that the blood pressure did not shoot up as much. They also found that the cortisol did not increase as much, but they had a very small sample size in this. Again, 28. I don't know what's going on there. I guess the results that they found weren't significant, but with a larger sample, maybe we would see that was a significant change. But it seems that there's something going on there in any case. So essentially the take-home message is that too much stress is maladaptive. It doesn't function to serve us anymore in terms of our survival, it would seem, and that it can be associated with mental health problems. And that yoga can have an impact on stress reactivity and how stressed people feel, and therefore it can have an impact on mental health outcomes. And that's it.